A very good afternoon, distinguished guests, speakers, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Archana and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, I welcome you to the ISAS CII panel discussion on India Budget 2019, Features, Impact and Prospects. To start the proceedings, I would like to invite the following distinguished speakers on the stage. Mr. Vinod Rai, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, and former Comptroller and Auditor General of India. Mr. K.V. Rao, Chair, CII India Business Forum, Singapore, and Resident Director, ASEAN Tata Sons Limited. Mr. Rohan Solapurkar, Tax Partner, Deloitte, Singapore. Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economic Policy, ISAS NUS. The panel discussion will be chaired by Dr. Dipinder S. Randhawa, Senior Research Fellow, ISAS NUS. I now hand over the session to Dr. Randhawa. Please.
Thank you, Archana. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome on a balmy day to Kentridge. Quick word about this campus. We are in a beautiful location which is steeped in history and nature. Within a kilometer of here, you've got a heritage walk and there's a long history of what transpired during the Second World War. And you also find quite a diversity of biolife as well. There are quite a few birds and other itinerant animals around, including a family of otters that made their way through campus. Nobody quite figured out what they were doing or where they were headed for, but they got admission. They got admission indeed. But we want to discuss a more weighty matter today, and that is the Indian budget. This is, of course, an annual event, and while hearing of the session, I was reminded of a colleague in humanities who said, how interesting could a budget be? And I mentioned an eminent jurist and constitutional expert and lawyer, diplomat, Mr. Nani Palkhiwala, whose addresses in Bombay used to fill up National Stadium, the Brabourne Stadium of 20,000 people. So it is certainly a development which gives a clear idea of what the nation is aspiring to do, where they're planning to go, and taking stock. Needless to say, on the back of the resounding mandate this government received, there were a lot of expectations about the budget. Are there going to be some radical steps that they're going to embark on, which will unfree the shackles on the economy? Are there going to be bold initiatives along the line of what was promised in 2014, which was less of government, more of governance, or more of the large blue chip programs that were launched on virtually every year? As it turns out, this is a fairly sedate budget. No big surprises, and to some extent, if you were to read between the tea leaves, the predominant thinking may have been to consolidate what's going on and deal with the immediate problems at hand. And the immediate issues have to do with reviving growth in the economy and how to improve infrastructure where there are massive gaps that prevail. And also, I think, to consolidate the existing programs which have been launched over the last few years. So I'm just going to quickly outline a couple of what I could do, infer from the budget. And the main message, as I mentioned, was the infrastructure. And the emphasis has been on nurturing investment in order to revive growth, both domestic and external investment. And again, on consolidating the programs that have been undertaken. Things that remain more or less the same is the emphasis, and that's reassuring, on fiscal consolidation. There are a few gaps out there, a few curiosities which will come up during the course of the discussion. Disinvestment, what a lot of people were hoping for, including the flagship carrier of the country, Air India, there's some promise of that, but no very explicit statement. And on industrial and agricultural policy, there seem to be incremental changes. I guess the questions that are going to crop up over the next year and subsequently are, do we have a clear pathway to a $5 trillion economy? And what will it take? What are the measures that are going to take to restructure the economy and to put it on that, on that trajectory? The initial results are somewhat disquieting. Gross fixed capital formation has been fairly low. It's yet to pick up. Private consumption has picked up what did pick up initially, but it's again a bit sluggish, and that's been a major driver of growth. Savings rates are low, and agriculture continues to dominate the news. There's a huge amount of agricultural distress and distortions in input markets. Many of these factors, of course, a legacy of decades of planning. Looking ahead, of course, there are major issues that India faces. Rapid urbanization, environmental degradation, which has been sustained over the last 3 decades at least of rapid growth, declining agricultural productivity, and a major challenge which I think has not been addressed sufficiently, which is generally attributed to bleeding hearts for some reason, is investments and ramping up human capital, which includes both education and health. There is some attention on being paid to that, and what one certainly hopes is the initiatives that have been launched thus far will be consolidated and ramped up. So we'll be taking up many of these issues. We're fortunate in having a very distinguished panel with us. Mr. Vinod Rai needs no introduction. He's a former Comptroller and Auditor General of India. He's chairman of the panel of external auditors, an institution within the United Nations system, on the board of several banks, insurance companies. And what's not mentioned out here is also chairman of the Committee of Arbitration, set up by the Supreme Court of India to oversee cricket. There's some disquieting news, of course, last evening, the outcome of the game, so we won't dwell on that for the moment. Each speaker will have about 15 minutes, max of 15 minutes. And I'd now like to hand the floor over to Mr. Rai. So a quick word on the format. There are about 15 minutes for each speaker, and then we'll have a short quick question and answer session from the panel, and then open it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipender. I offer to come and stand here and speak so that you're a bigger target in case people want to make a go at you. As Dipender said, it's an annual exercise that we have, the budget, but every year the surprise is tremendous about the huge build-up that the budget gets. And I think it's more media activity than corporates or anybody or the citizen. The citizen is not really bothered. He's only worried about the price of petrol and things like that. There's nothing more that he has interest in. This, of course, budget had a bigger build-up. It was Modi 2.0. There was great interest in a first full-time lady finance minister presenting a budget, of course. And the interest was so much that they noticed that iconic photograph which comes out before any finance minister presents a budget in India is of the finance minister carrying a briefcase. That briefcase is supposed to contain the secret documents, which is the budget, which is not in public domain till such time as it is committed to Parliament. This time, the finance minister was not carrying a briefcase, and she carried what media termed as a bahi khata. Bahi khata actually it means is a ledger. Ledger for, yeah, but it was termed as a bahi khata. But anyway, I think there was just too much of expectation from what this budget could bring about. After all, how much of committed expenditure the government has and how much of flexibility it has, minus that committed expenditure, to be able to announce path-breaking things. 1991 was very different, of course. But I must take you back in time to the first full budget which was presented by Mr. R.K. Shanmugam Chetty, 1948. He had presented a budget earlier. He was the first finance minister of the country. But post-partition, post-independence, it was only an interim budget. He presented the first full budget on 28th of February 1948. That date has also now been changed over the last 5 years. The budget is no longer presented on 28th of February. It used to be 28th of February at 5 p.m. But now all that has been changed. And his taxation proposal contained a super tax. He was very worried that this super tax might in some ways retard growth. So he decided to reduce that super tax. And he decided to reduce by that super tax by the princely sum of 1 anna. I don't know how many of you know how much 1 anna is. The rupee those days contained 16 annas, and 1 anna had 6 paise in it. It was equivalent to, no, not 6 paise, 12 paise, sorry. 1 paisa became equivalent to 6 naya paisa. That's how it became. So he reduced the tax by 1 anna. And he reworked the slabs. But the margin, which today in the last budget for super tax is 400 crores, or what's it? It will be 4 billion? 4 billion rupees, was then 350,000 rupees only. That was the last time it was experimented to in a big way. But then what was the size of the budget? 1.9 billion revenues. Sorry, 1.79 billion revenues and 1.92 billion was the expenditure. The deficit was just 260 million rupees, 26 million rupees only. But anyway, let's fast forward now to 2019. The tax on super rich or super rich countries, individuals or companies, it's supposed to be only 0.7% of the total, which means 7,000 to 8,000 persons only it is going to affect. It's been introduced, but why I mention this is in the context of some structural changes that the government is likely to bring about. I think, and I have no privy to any other knowledge, I think this is to soften the blow of some labor reforms that the government is going to introduce. The government is committed to collapsing 55 labor laws into 4 codes, combining them. And the first one, the decision has been taken yesterday. Today's newspapers carry it for. I think the government is positioning itself to say that, look, we are neither pro-rich nor are we pro-promoter, because any reform in labor or labor laws is going to have obviously some pushback from the unions, though the unions today are not really as strong as they used to be, say, about 10, 12 years back. But all the same, there is going to be a pushback, and government would be worried about their unions also. So I think they are positioning themselves to be able to say that, look, we are not pro-promoter, we are not pro-rich, we are in fact intending to tax them further, and that is the vote. But the thing that would make me happy, and I can't get the auditor out of me, is the introduction of certain amount of discipline in what they have announced. First is acceptance of the glide path to fiscal deficit, which means till 2021, they would want the fiscal deficit to be brought down to 3% of the GDP. It was expected that they would have a fiscal deficit of 3.4% this time, but it turned out to be better. They have announced only 3.3%. So I think some amount of restraint in spending, public spending, some amount of discipline, the government proposes to have on itself, which I think is a very noble development, and I think it will take them. Second is that they have not gone in for very many major fiscal stimuli. Otherwise, governments tend to announce it, though normally it's all announced before an election period, but they have not gone into announce any of those fiscal stimuli because there was not too much of scope. Public sector borrowing, public sector in the broader sense, borrowing had in any case crowded out, covered all of household savings, financial savings, and any more fiscal stimuli would have pushed up interest rates further. Now, one bold decision to borrow externally. Why I call it bold decision, amount is, I guess, is not going to be large. It won't be more than $7 to $10 billion. Nothing very major. But why I call it a bold decision is because then government would be subjecting itself to scrutiny by the investing public or investing institutions outside. That's the time when you're willing to throw up your balance sheet and say, okay, whatever rating the sovereign is getting, and that would be the threshold for any subsovereign borrowing or any corporate borrowing after that. So I think it's a very happy development. It's a development where I think government should get some brownie points on it, because it's not often that any sovereign is willing to throw itself up open and say, here it is, scrutinize my performance, and then peg an interest rate or peg the returns to what I should subject myself to on whatever bonds that are floated. Because in any case, borrowing internally would have again crowded out the market. And number two, that they were creating in some ways space for corporates to borrow internally. And that's a happy development. So to that extent, I think these three things I would take as a positive, which means the glide path, the fiscal stimulus, not having a fiscal stimulus, and the decision to borrow abroad, but for reasons which are different from what I think the government would have thought of for themselves. The biggest problem that the government was facing in wanting to regenerate the economy was the lack of credit growth, lack of capital. Considering the fact that public sector banks in India control about 2/3 of the total lending activity, it's probably down to about 60% now. These banks were in a fairly poor shape in terms of the non-performing assets, in terms of the capital having been eroded, and in terms of the capacity of the government to be able to shore up that capital. And we had expected that the government would be putting aside what I would call 40,000, 50,000 crore rupees. But I think the government has come out with a larger amount, 70,000 crores that they have come up with, which is good in the sense that it's timely, the amount is substantial, and this was a time when there is some credit growth which is being seen as green shoots in the economy. And the other thing is that these banks have been given a 10% guarantee for the first 6 months for bonds that they would buy off well-credited, well-rated NBFCs also. So that kind of a guarantee gives some direction to the banks. Number one, some encouragement to the banks to lend to NBFCs. Number two, that after the collapse of the ILFS, NBFCs were undergoing a bankruptcy kind of a situation, and the fear psychosis that had been built up was fairly substantial. The support and encouragement to affordable housing, very substantial, and I think that is where the economy will kickstart itself, because of the fact that housing, real estate, construction activity in India is the one which really gives growth, ground level growth, because then it involves labor, it involves all construction materials, and of course credit flowing into that sector. So I think affordable housing, where they have relaxed the tax rebates, number one. Number two, they have said that they will construct 195 crore houses, which is a very substantial number. The much criticized cess on fuel. I would sincerely believe that, considering the fact that fuel prices are expected to decline in future, if the collections of this cess actually in some ways ring-fenced and put out separately and used only for infrastructure, it would turn out to be a good move by the government. They are committed to growing infrastructure, even though you drew attention to that also. I would sincerely feel that in case India cannot grow its physical infrastructure, power, roads, railroads, airports, etc., it will constrain the growth of the economy. And this is the time when they have to put in big money. Obviously, spending will have to start from the government side. And they are committed to about 100 lakh crores, which means 1 trillion in the next 5 years. This cess should be able to provide them a sizable amount of investment. Another good move has been the attempt to try and monetize surplus land owned by government and public sector enterprises. Railways, they have huge amount of surplus lands. Life Insurance Corporation, defense, huge amounts in the cantonments and other places, and they've been lying idle. This needs to be monetized through maybe public-private partnership or whatever the government can think of doing. And I think it will go a long way to be able to help the government in shoring up and increasing investment activity. I think before I close, I just want to draw attention to one more issue which is very critical in India. It's not a budget issue, but I think that's an issue which might be posing alarm signals already within the country, and that is insufficiency of water, fresh water in the country. 40% of the areas seem to be reaching kind of emergency situation, and in case government does not take action much in advance to be able to conserve water resources, link rivers, and take steps like that, water might reach crisis proportions. So the government has consolidated 3 ministries under one ministry, and that's called Jal Shakti or something like that, the name of the ministry, where they have given one single authority to a minister to be able to take steps so that they don't operate in silos, one silo not really being able to talk to the other silo or realizing the steps that the other silo is taking, with the result that quite often there are overlapping of schemes and activities. And 1,592 blocks in 256 districts have been identified where they have to do take immediate action, and whatever steps that is required depending upon the local situation, obtaining in that thing. I think that is a very positive move considering the difficulties that the country is facing. So on the whole, I think we look too much into the budget. We feel the budget is going to be the economic panacea for the country, or panacea for the economic problems of the country. No budget can really solve it. But in some ways, and I think we will, as we go along, discuss that 5 trillion approach also, where I think some sowings or some early seedlings have been planted without much fanfare. And I would feel that as we go along the next 6 months, we are likely to see some announcements which would help make some structural changes to be able to benefit. If we can bring about the disinvestment that the government has committed to do, if we can bring about the sale of Air India, I think that would send very substantial signals into the economy that the government is committed to be able to. I would be concerned about agriculture, but as we go along we can discuss that, because agriculture is going to be a very major problem. With this present monsoon being so deficient, I think the amount that has been set aside for R&D, the amount for other productivity increasing activities needs to be looked into much more closely. So those are my opening remarks. As we go along, I think we will add to more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rai. As you pointed out, hopefully what we are seeing is the first green shoots of revival in the economy. And I'm sorry. We're hopefully seeing the first green shoots of revival in the economy, a much needed stimulus. And if credit growth were to pick up and buttressed by foreign borrowings, that would go a long way. And you kind of wonder about how the mechanics of banks lending to NBFCs, which are already in trouble, there'll be quite a challenge navigating through that. But there are certainly encouraging signs on the horizon. Now I have the pleasure to turn to Mr. K.V. Rao. Mr. K.V. Rao has a very distinguished career in the corporate sector. If I were to read the number of companies he's associated with, that would take up better part of the afternoon. But he came in with the first Indian company, the first conglomerate that set up house in Singapore in the early days, and which went a long way to giving a very good name to the Indian corporate sector in the incipient stage in Singapore, and that's the Tata Sons. He wears multiple hats within the diaspora in Singapore. You can read about that in the description. Mr. Rao, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, friends. I want to recognize my senior, Mr. Girija Pandey here, who has had a much illustrious history of setting up Tata, since you mentioned here, and building up TCS. Very glad to see you here. Well, I'll make some broader comments about the big picture of what we have seen as a budget. Budget invariably creates huge amount of excitement. And particularly in India, cricket and budget both compete with each other, and both of them are seemingly happening around the same time. I started my career not in finance. I trained as a marketing man, and often I use the same lens to look at life, and I see some very interesting pictures. If you look at the current government in India, it follows the marketing logic so perfectly. It has created brand Modi so perfectly in India that it's going to be a very long-lasting brand. And the results have proved that. They're outstanding in their communication, whether it is the Prime Minister or the party. They think through what they want to say. The departure number one is, this year the manner in which the budget was presented was a bit of a talk of the town by the opposition too, that it was different. It had a lot of rhetorical emphasis in terms of where they want to take the country and so on. And many of us with grey hair would know India's development history, that we had 5-year plans for many, many years together from the Nehruvian period. Now we are on an annual budget. And to look at a country in the prism of 12 months is perhaps to do a disservice to oneself. So the fundamental shift that I see is, this budget is more directional. And the entire budget speech is more about what they want to achieve as objectives. They have given roadmaps to various areas in which the government wants to work. And they clearly have the 5 years time frame. Therefore, it's more like looking at the first year of a 5-year plan for India, which I think is a fantastic thing to have a long-term vision. Obviously, when you look at a 5-year vision for a complex nation like India, you will not get the granularity that you need. The government was taken to task by a number of analysts in the talks that followed, that there wasn't enough data to support what you're saying. And every time the government went back and said, look at the annexures. I watched yesterday the Parliament discussions on the budget, where Minister Nirmala Sitharaman provided all the numbers of granularity that the opposition asked for. Now, just coming to the larger pictures and what is important, there are 3 legs on this budget that I see very strongly, 3 pillars of this budget. Everybody believes and knows India needs huge infrastructure for making it future ready. First piece is infrastructure. There's a huge emphasis. I'll share a little more about what I understand from this budget on infrastructure. The second is digitalization has done a tremendous transformation, and it's a continuity and focus on digitalization and simplification of government processes. One of the reasons the government came back so strongly is because of the digital revolution that it has caused in terms of Aadhaar card, in terms of banks, in terms of bank accounts, in terms of giving benefit to the man at the bottom of the pyramid. And each one has received a benefit, and that's really played back politically rich dividends to the government. And I think further move on the digitalization will be exceptionally helpful. The third focus is economists try to look for big bang announcements, but I think the focus on MSME, medium and small scale enterprises, is actually a driver towards employment, because in India, the two largest employment circles are agriculture, where 65% of India's population is present. The second, obviously, is the town classes, the urbanized people, where you say 35% of the people are there, and the focus on MSMEs is going to give rich dividends for the longer term. A couple more things. Tax is pretty much rationalized. There are no shocks in the taxation side. I think corporate tax has been kept very pragmatic, and particularly those growing companies at 400 crores and below, keeping the tax level at the same is a very positive step. It's a consistent budget. It's a continuity. I think sometimes we look for discontinuity in corporations, but disruptions and discontinuities can also be extremely lethal. And when it comes to countries and the future of nations, I think you need to have a predictable future, and having fiscal discipline and a continuity of the tight budgets they managed in 18, 19, and 2021 will be wonderful. Labor laws. Labor laws, it's still not visible. Often I feel many budgets, again, are somewhat amphibian, any budget of any country. And why I call it amphibian is, if you were to use a marketing language, if you personify a brand, how does it look like, and how does a budget look like? A budget is, if it's an amphibian, it's in part water and part in space. It's more like a mermaid. You can see some parts of it which are very attractive. There are some parts which are still not clear. And I think it's going to be a fishtail, or is going to be something more detailed. We do not know, because I think the reform of labor is long overdue. I don't think we still have a clarity, but as Mr. Rai says, I will believe that some good thinking is behind what they plan to do, and they may have to take some tough decisions around that, which will bring stability and economic growth into India, particularly in industry. Agriculture. Agriculture doesn't have smart fixes, because India has been an agrarian economy for all its history, and change is a laborious and difficult process to change habits of our smallholding farmers and others. I think there's been a lot of improvements that have been done around direct credits and not fertilizer subsidies. They have done a big transformation in the area of agricultural prices, because if the price mechanism works well in India and the supply chain works, the farmers are benefited. Roughly 70,000 crores of expense on the agri side has been raised to 130,000, so it's a huge increase. I haven't gone granularly into which are the areas, but I think elements of crop insurance, elements of pensions for farmers, good marketing prices, minimum support prices are all very positives. There's been much said about zero-based agriculture, and I went up reading what it is about. It's about taking organic agriculture, less fertilizers, and going back to manures. And also there is a certain element, I see a little echo of the cow politics, as it's called in India, that it will be around a lot of farming practices which take you back to the ancient ways of doing it, which I believe has worked very well in Karnataka, and they want to replicate. So I think it's a great idea, the impact of which is not known. Some areas of agriculture which we are unclear of is there hasn't been too much of mention at the finance budget level of what they're doing about agricultural output increase and productivity. I think India has been languishing at a very low rate of productivity in many of our crops. I think that's something that needs to be looked at. Well, finance and banking sector, they put in another 70,000 crores to clean up. I think the process of cleaning up has started the last 2 years. They have made significant progress. I don't think this can happen overnight until they find some new discoveries of non-performing assets. But I think the problem is addressed and problem is getting fixed. With regards to capital, We talked about capital availability in India for industry. I think some of the steps they've taken should unleash a better availability of capital for growth. The environment should slowly change, and also the interest rate cuts which are coming in should be helpful. Some very positive things on retail, on foreign investment. A few clusters have been opened up, but there hasn't been a broad brush sort of announcement on trying to accelerate direct foreign investment. But as Mr. Rai said, India is borrowing very little from international markets. It's less than 4% of its GDP, whereas Japan has about 5% plus, a developed country. So I think there's a huge headroom for India to really go after its spends. Last but not the least, I would like to outline 3 or 4 areas which are important for Singapore. The infrastructure spend that they have announced comes to $1.46 trillion in the next 5 years, which roughly translates to $300 billion a year. The run rate on infrastructure investments, 2018, has been roughly $100 billion. The question is, how do you ramp it up from $100 billion to $300 billion, which is the vision and the plan for India, consistently for the next 5 years. So my call to infra companies, 7 of them of Singapore which are present in India, I think the sky is the limit for infra companies to participate in India's growth, whether it is smart cities, urban living, housing, what have you, because the roads, housing, and all of that has got an explosive growth path ahead of themselves. Another area very positive for Singapore is, I think we should look at defense technologies. I think many of our companies have an extremely good association with Indian defense, and the political association is very close. There's a huge amount of trust. That could be something that could be really grown further. Of course, smart cities I've mentioned. Now, a couple of things which are not very clear, and we need to be really cautious about it and not be taken completely by the enthusiasm of the announcements. One of which is India's lagging issue on disinvestment targets. Every year we take a disinvestment target and don't achieve that when it comes to public sectors. This year they've taken 1 lakh crores. We've got to see how much they achieve out of that. They've done some good things like electric vehicles, incentives to electric vehicles, but that's actually less than 2% of India's current automobile production or what, but it's an incentive worth recognizing. What you're doing for startups is a very interesting area, but startups do not really happen because government gives you an incentive or a disincentive. Startup happens because global funds come to India because there is creativity, there is innovation, there is capability, there is depth of market, and there is a track record of things that are happening. I remember in 2016, $9.8 billion of international money went through the VC funds in funding something like 980 different startups in India. This is 16 or 17 when I looked at it very closely, out of which 100 were identified to become unicorns and global scale. So that's the kind of innovation that is happening. I think whatever comes from the government as a support to that is very good. I'm glad that they unwound the tax on angel investing, which I think was not a good thought in the first phase. There have been commentaries on interim budget and actual is just about the same. What's the difference? I think sometimes sameness is beautiful. Budgets don't have to be disruptive, as I said, to make an impact. I'm very glad with what has come together as a budget in India, and we've got to see this not in the prism of 12 months, but I think for the next 5 years, it has given a clear pathway where the country is going, and that's something that is required for foreign investors. Directly on foreign investment, I do wish there could have been more measures, but I would imagine that they will come as we move forward, as they clean up and restructure some of the financial industry related problems that India is facing currently. I think they've made some moves in it on foreign investment. I'm sure Rohan will be able to share a lot more on that. So thank you, gentlemen. I'll be happy to take some questions when we move to that.
Thank you, Mr. Rao. And as you pointed out, boring budgets are good. You don't need any nasty surprises. And the other reassuring aspect is also the fact that you see consolidation of the trend over the last 5 years and a roadmap for the next 5 years. And I also stand corrected. Thank you for pointing out, of course, I overlooked Mr. Girija Pandey, who's sitting out here, was the founder, in a sense, of Tata Sons enterprises and Vent, which paved the ground for further expansion of Indian enterprises in Singapore. I now have the pleasure to turn to Mr. Rohan Salpukar. He's a very accomplished and highly experienced tax partner with Deloitte, with experience in London, Hong Kong, India, and of course now in Singapore. He advises a number of multinationals and other entities on navigating their way through the investments in India.
Thank you. As all my earlier other speakers have mentioned, the budget is always an exciting time in India, partly created by media, partly created by consultants like myself, and just the general hype about everything that happens. And of course, tax is always an important element, which has always been an important element in the Indian budget on a year-to-year basis, because if one has looked at the finance bill, which makes all the amendments into the Income Tax Act, the finance bill itself runs into hundreds of pages. So trying to analyze that is a big challenge in itself. So this year's budget, in a sense, was pretty small in the context of the changes that happened in income tax. And while it was largely expected that there would be minor changes, one really didn't expect it to be so minor in that sense. Of course, there are changes. No Indian budget will be complete without there being any changes in income tax, right? But before I move into the income tax changes, let me just spend a couple of minutes on some sort of policy changes that have happened. And when I say policy changes, when you look at the Indian budget, whilst that is for the next 12 months, historically there have always been regulatory changes coming through the entire 12-month period. And these changes happen through either the Ministry of Industry and Commerce or through the Reserve Bank of India. Three big changes that have happened from a regulatory perspective, and when I look at regulatory, I put it in the context of foreign investment and investment going into India. The firstly, foreign direct investment into media has been opened up. When I say media, it's more in the context of animation, special effects, all of that. That's opened up, so you can have 100% foreign investment in that. The second area in which it has also opened up, and this is let me rephrase that and articulate that differently. There used to be, or there is, foreign investment which is permissible into single brand retail trading. So which means that if I'm a single brand owner, I can invest into India, provided there are certain conditions. One of the bugbear of foreign investment in single brand retail is the requirement to have a 30% local sourcing. To give you an example, let's say if tomorrow Nike wants to open up facilities in India and wants to make investment into India, it needs to have a 30% minimum local sourcing, which means Nike has to buy 30% of its components or products, raw materials, from Indian suppliers. And that's been a big challenge among foreign investors, because they've always come back and said that one of the reasons why we don't source from India is perhaps the quality of the raw materials. Finance Minister in her speech this time said that they are going to have a relook at this and over time issue clarifications. Hopefully one interprets this and reads between the lines to say that they might either dilute the requirement or they may come back and have new set of requirements and regulations for single brand retail trading. So again, sounds positive in that sense. A third sort of change that happened may not be directly from a foreign direct investment perspective, but I don't know why that change has happened, is for listed companies, you now need to have a minimum public holding of 35% as opposed to 25%. So if you've got listed companies, the minimum public float now is 35%. It used to be 25%, it's now gone up to 35%. What that means needs to be seen if you've got foreign companies or you've got companies which are listed and who've got public shareholding of about 27% or 28%, what are they going to do? Are they going to delist over time, or are they going to increase float? So that's a change that has happened. I don't know the implications of that, but I don't know whether that is good or bad and the intent and the rationale behind this. So So that's from a regulatory and a policy perspective. And moving on to taxes, no big bang as expected and anticipated. There was a huge talk of inheritance tax, estate duty, wealth tax coming through. None of them happened. Whether there's a surreptitious or a backdoor entrance for super rich is something we'll talk about a little later. And that's perhaps also because there's on the cards a new direct tax code which is likely to come about. There was an initiative and a move for the direct tax code to be introduced some years back. Most of those provisions and regulations from the direct tax code have now got introduced into the main Income Tax Act. So it got sort of on a slow path. In November 17, there was another initiative to recreate a committee to look at the direct tax code bill again. That has been constituted. So there is an anticipation that there will be a new Income Tax Act and therefore no significant changes. Corporate tax rates are 25% for companies which have a revenue of more than 400 crores or below 400 crores. 400 crores is roughly about 80 million Singh. But if you know, the challenge is not income tax rates. The challenge, my friends, is we still have a surcharge and we still have a cess. So which means that if your taxable income, and companies don't pay tax based on revenues. Company pay taxes based on what my taxable income is and what my chargeable income is. And today, if your chargeable income is more than 10 crores, 10 crores is roughly about $2 million. You have an effective tax rate of 29.12%. So this 25% is then topped up by a 12% surcharge and is then topped up by a 4% cess to make your effective tax rate 29.12. And then if you declare a dividend, you pay an additional dividend distribution tax of almost another 20%. So I cannot understand why we just can't make it a flat rate of 22 or 25%. I mean, look at the US is going to 21%, UK has gone to 17%. I understand we are not a service economy. We want to be manufacturing, and I understand we can't compete with Singapore. But at least let's bring in a flat rate and let's not have it on 400 crores, more, less. Say, just have a simple tax rate to say my tax is going to be 25%, period. I hope that day is not far. There are some benefits introduced for investments in the mega sectors, which are manufacturing of semiconductors or chips or fabrication. The whole philosophy of the government was to move away from having profit or investment linked incentives. But now we are again going back to say, for certain investments made in mega sort of projects, 100% of the profits will be exempt. And the reason or the rationale given by the finance minister is to encourage global manufacturing companies to come and set up operations in India. So this is Make in India 2.0 in a sense. But if you're wanting to go away and reduce tax rates, forget the incentives. I mean, people are coming to India because there's a market, there's an opportunity. But let's not go back to the old regime of trying to link taxes to, 100% profit exemptions or investments that you make in India. Give them better facilities, give them land, give them more robust labor laws, and you'll see investments coming into India. Investments and incentives for startups. Again, startups has been a pretty good sort of opportunity for youngsters, if I may say, to look at alternative sources of employment. And India, mind you, has a depth of technical talent. I don't think India is lacking talent or dearth of talent in intellectual property. I think the youngsters are smart, and they need some incentives starting their businesses, especially from a tax perspective. And the reasons why, I may differ from Mr. Rao in the context of incentives for startups is because when you look at the tax laws sometimes don't facilitate the encouragement of startups. And one of them was in the context of carry forward of losses. Because when you have startups, invariably they have losses. And the world we live in, higher the loss, higher the value. Right? That's the way it is moving right now. So there was a regulation in India, or tax laws in India, which really sort of restricted those losses being carried forward by startups if there were change in shareholders. So they've come and sort of addressed that issue, so which is a positive one. The second issue that was addressed in the context of startups was in the context of what is called an angel tax. An angel tax means that if there was a subscription offer, or let's say an investor invested into a startup company and invested in excess of what the fair market value of the share was, then the differential used to be treated as income. However, there were certain exemptions that were given, provided you had certain clarifications or filled in certain forms and gave certain declarations. But that was restricted to only a particular set of investments or companies. They have now broadened this, and they have made it sort of with a broad brush, tried to expand and said that if you make these investments in excess of the fair market value and you file certain declarations and make certain commitments, we will not come back and question you on the value of the shares. So again, a sort of a good tax or a good law that is introduced. The third was in the context of reinvestment of capital gains. If you sold a residential property and you invested some of those gains into a startup, then the gains were exempt, provided the startup and provided the property was sold before 2019. They've now extended that till 2021. Again, there was a condition which said that you cannot invest more than 50% in the startup. They've done away with that condition also. So again, in the sense from a startup perspective, they seem to be pushing and trying to get give the startups as much facilities to raise capital, and also at the same time give the investor some sort of benefit to make those investments. Some things which were not good: tax on buyback for listed companies. So if listed companies buy back shares, they are now subject to a buyback tax of 20%. There are certain incentives given to companies set up in the International Finance Service Center, which is in Gujarat, the GIFT city. So they have certain incentives given to encourage companies set up operations in that center. More, in the context of tax withholding, exemptions from tax withholding on interest, exemptions from dividend distributions, etc. So they're trying to encourage it. We haven't seen significant number of companies move into the international finance sector, but this is one way of trying to encourage them. With respect to individuals, they've now come back and increased taxes for the super rich. So anyone who has income in excess of 2 crores, which is roughly about 400,000 Sing dollars, you have a 30% tax rate, on top of which you have a 25% surcharge, and on top of that you pay a 4% cess. So your effective tax rate is about 37%. And for those who have income in excess of about 5 crores, which is roughly about 1 million Sing, you end up paying about 42% tax. So for every 100 rupees individuals earn, you pay 42 to the government. And this is where there is no social security. I can understand countries which have a high tax rate, but also provide you social security in the context of education, in the context of healthcare. This begs the question, 42%, is whether this will lead to any sort of aggressive tax planning from corporates or individuals, which might again throw up a whole host of litigation issues. The other issue is, mind you, ladies and gentlemen, is investments from abroad which go in the form of trust. So if I have a FPI, which is a foreign portfolio investor scheme, or other sort of global funds, they invest typically into the Indian markets using a structure, and the very common structure is through the use of a trust. Fortunately or unfortunately, from an India perspective, the trust gets treated in the same bracket as an individual, which means the trust will end up paying a 42% tax on income earned in excess of $1 million, and which is very common for these FPIs, which is one of the big reasons why you see over the last 2 days after the budget was announced, the stock market collapsed. This is one of the big reasons. The Ministry of Finance has come back and said that they will issue some clarifications on this. We anticipate and we hope that they will be announced sooner rather than later. Then they came back with some small changes on, additional deductions for individuals on interest on house property. If I buy an electric car and I borrow money for that, I pay interest, there's a deduction on that. All very good. But I hope we have infrastructure to, fill in gas into that electric vehicle. That electric vehicle, the infrastructure to support the running and the maintenance of electric vehicles needs to be put into place, whilst we are encouraging electric vehicles to come along. But it's all not all doom and gloom in India. Indian tax authorities, to my mind, are some of the smartest people you will come across. They may be aggressive, but you will see most of their positions, tax positions that they've taken, have been vindicated by what is now called BEPS, which is base erosion and profit shifting. India has always taken a position that we want to tax profits in India because activity is in India, which is what BEPS is saying. Very often I've spoken to tax officers from other countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, China, and they want tax decisions from India to come about because they can apply the same principles in their locations. So the Indian tax authorities and the finance ministry officials are fairly smart. So I'm hoping two things in conclusion: that A, some of these anomalies or lacunae in this budget that we are seeing will get rectified and addressed over the next 12-month period. That's one. And secondly, I hope that the direct tax code bill, which gets announced, or which will be announced hopefully sooner rather than later, will address some of these issues and align itself with more international tax rates and international policies. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll address any questions that you have later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Solapurkar. You helped us navigate with a great deal of clarity the maze that is the tax code. And your point, just this morning I was reading about how the France has decided to levy a tax on the earnings of American tech giants, and it's a manifestation of what you just mentioned. And the US is going to retaliate on that count, simply because Google and Facebook and so forth, their earnings are extremely difficult to track. And because of Ireland, which hosts them, you can't get a consensus. And this is an issue, it's a global issue. And that's one area certainly where India seems to be taking the lead. And we hope to revisit the issue of startups as well. That's a very thorny issue. Thank you again. It's now my pleasure to turn to my colleague, Dr. Amitendu Palit. He's the lead in trade and economics policy at ISAS and an authority on multilateral trade negotiations and on India's engagement internationally. Dr. Palit.
Thank you very much, Dipinder. And since I'm the last of the panelists, let me take this opportunity to go back to the beginning, from where we began. There was a very brief allusion to a number of $5 trillion. And let me just revisit the budget on the back of that number. If there's anything called a vision statement right now in the Indian economic landscape, I think one can look at this number of $5 trillion, which comes from none other than the Prime Minister of India, a size that the Indian economy is supposed to achieve by the year 2024. Today, the Indian economy is nominally, in dollar terms, valued at almost $3 trillion, around 2.8, 2.9, which kind of makes it a neck and neck sixth largest economy in the world, with an economy which is supposed to suffer its biggest catastrophe by 31st of October, none other than the United Kingdom. So if $5 trillion is the objective to be achieved in another 5 years, then it doesn't take a great degree of expertise in mathematics to come to the conclusion that India will have to grow in dollar terms at an average rate of 11.5% for the next 5 years. Now, on this, if one employs a kind of a last 5 to 6 year average of inflation rate, then one comes down to a real GDP growth number of roughly 7.7%. That's the number at which the Indian economy needs to grow for the next 5 years, consistently, to reach the number of $5 trillion. And the expectation that many had, because this is the number which the Prime Minister mentioned, this is the number which the Economic Survey mentioned the day before the budget announced. Unfortunately, the Economic Survey becomes a document of the past right after it is announced, as the budget precedes all discussions on it. One would have expected the budget to actually lay out a framework for proceeding to this direction of $5 trillion economy. Now, has it done so? Let's look at the budget and look at some reflections in this regard. The problem is that the budget has two limitations. One limitation is that too much is expected from the budget. Actually too much, because at the end of the day, the budget is nothing but a statement of accounts of the public finances of the central government in India. Over the years, though, it's become also a document for containing important policy decisions and giving a broad economic, macroeconomic policy signal. Now, if India needs to grow by 7.7% over the next 5 years, what does it need to do? If one addresses this basic, simple question, then probably the answer lies in going back and revisiting the character of the Indian economy. The Indian economy today, the biggest driver of economic growth in India is personal private consumption. Whatever the Indians are spending out of their pockets is actually what is driving the Indian economy. Now, this is in contrast to a large number of emerging markets. I'm not even getting into comparisons with China, but a large number of other emerging markets where, as opposed to consumption, it is actually investment, which is the main driver of economic growth in the country. Now, India has two problems in this regard. One, its savings rate is rather low. It's just at around 26.5% of the GDP. Now, once the savings rate becomes this low, it becomes very difficult to obtain the investment rate of around 34-35% of the GDP, which is ideally what India should have in order to take it to a growth of 7.6 to 7.7%. The savings rate has become abysmally low, not because of private personal savings having declined, but because of institutional savings having gone down very rapidly. And that has much to do with the current state of crisis that is being faced by Indian banks, Indian public sector institutions, so on and so forth. Now, from this situation, the turnaround has to come by charging investment. Could the budget have done this? Again, the budget had a very severe limitation in this regard. The limitation was that this budget cannot be looked at in isolation from what has been done over the last 3, 4, 5 years. And over the last 3 years, the government has consciously moved towards making the Indian economy an essentially consumption-driven, welfare-oriented economy. Because of sufficient jobs not being created, because of adequate livelihoods not being created, because of economic activity in general being depressed, what the government has tried to do is, through various public welfare schemes, put more money in the hands of the people. For that, you actually see the core of core schemes having come into the budget. You see the allocations being successively stepped up for the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, for the Prime Minister Kisan Scheme, and for a large number of other measures, including crop insurance. Now, the problem that the budget presented on 5th of July had was, it could not have undone all these welfare schemes. Those schemes had to be maintained because they are part of the government economic calculus now. And because those schemes had to be maintained, and because of the fact that those schemes, in certain respect, did have a role to play, in retrospective, did have a role to play in the huge political mandate which the government opted in the elections, those schemes had to be continued. And the allocation for those schemes through the budget had to be maintained. So this essentially limits the budget on the revenue side. It cannot cut expenditure, it cannot free up revenue, but it has to still obtain more revenues. Where does it obtain from? It cannot hit the income taxes as such, because while we talk about the super rich being taxed right now, the last vote on account budget presented on the last day of January this year had actually given a substantial relief to the middle class in terms of giving income, taxable income, up to 5 lakh tax-free. So that was already delivered. There was no going back on that. So there had to be some little corner cut somewhere. So go for the super rich and impose some surcharge. Because of the GST, which is an economist's delight but a central government of India's nightmare because it takes away the amount of flexibility the central government of India has on indirect tax mobilization. Today, the central government cannot step into the area of indirect taxes exogenously. It has to move through the GST parameter. So the only thing it could go back on was to tax those items which were outside the ambit of the GST, right, the petroleum products, petrol and diesel, so some money from there. The third item it has, and this item is a little bit of a wishful thinking, is what in budgetary terms we refer to as non-debt creating capital receipts, which are essentially the money that the government obtains by selling off its share in public sector holdings. And there's an aggressive public sector disinvestment program. There's an Air India story that we all know about, reflected in great detail in the budget, but it's put out. The problem over here is, and I think this is what Rohan alluded to, Mr. Rao also alluded to, public sector disinvestment programs in India really don't have a very fruitful history. They run into obstacles this way, that way. Even the most innocuous of public sector enterprises, whose names probably we don't even remember now, run into difficulties when they have to be taken to the market. So where is the government left with at the end of the day? And if one looks at this very simple basic charts, where the money comes in and where it goes out, unfortunately, the reliance of the government continues to remain on borrowings. The government of India has to borrow to support what it has started and to maintain what it aims to do. Now, over here, there is another problem. When the government of India hits the borrowing market in India hard, and this is what we economists are we refer to as a simple system of called crowding out. Because of the government's entry into the borrowing market for its large resource requirement, the private sector is driven out. And because the government has to borrow much at a quick pace and at a short time, it has to offer bonds which have relatively higher rates of interest. So the servicing liability on those bonds are high. Now today, the government of India has taken a calculated risk in this budget, and this is to approach the external markets for the first time through what is being referred to as a sovereign debt issue. To me, this is probably the most important part of this budget, simply because it could be a game changer for the Indian economy. If this works, then India would be praised as an economy which took a calculated risk in turning around its macroeconomic fundamentals, and this might actually give the government the pot of resources it is looking forward to for supporting its welfare programs, for charging its investment, because on investment, let's not forget one thing. Private investment doesn't happen in vacuum. Private investment needs enabling conditions, like what Rohan alluded to. But more importantly, private investment follows public investment. Unless there is public investment in large numbers, and the best example of this is none other than China. We talk about FDI in China, but all shares of investment to GDP for China show it is the public investment which continuously remains above the private investment under all circumstances. So unless the state comes in with large funds in public projects, private investment will not follow, particularly in a country like India, where the history of public-private partnerships is a highly distraught history. There are a large number of issues. So the government needs access to that resource with which it can continue accelerating investment. So the risk over here is that Government of India gets to go back to borrowing, but this time it's a borrowing with a difference. Instead of holding a debt with its own people, it's going out to the world for picking up a debt from the rest of the world. If it is able to pull this off, it might turn out to be a game changer, but there are also risks. There are risks in terms of foreign exchange fluctuations, foreign exchange risks. There are risks in terms of future repayment liabilities if the dollar-rupee rates moves adversely. And there is also the very initial risk that today the Indian paper or the Indian debt in terms of general corporate ratings is just above the junk rate. If one looks at rating agencies like the Moody's and the Standard & Poor's, the Indian sovereign rating doesn't really enjoy a very high credibility. But nonetheless, it's the promise of a $5 trillion economy. It's the promise of India continuing to remain, if not the fastest, among the fastest major growing economies of the world, and a market of 1.3 billion, out of which at least 30% has the ability to spend very, very heavily. So it's all these deciding factors which still make the Indian paper worthwhile for investors to look at. Now, who will invest in this paper is a different subject. That is a matter of a different detailed discussion altogether. But I think I would sum up the budget this way, that the budget within its overall limitations, and frankly, the budget really didn't have much that it could have done. I think this is a practicality which we need to accept, because the political commitment to the budget has already been taken. Today, what is left for the budget to do is to look back at that landscape and see what further it can do in terms of rational economic decisions. It has tried to do a few things. And for those who are looking out for the presence or absence of reforms in this budget, I think let me allude to two micro examples. One is that if one looks back at the last 10, 12 years at the Indian economy and look at the sectors which have really kept it charged, which have got money into the pockets of people, I think most of us would come to the conclusion that apart from the capital market, it's been the real estate, which has really put money in the hands of the people. The order of the day, I think, for the government was to revive real estate. There has been public initiatives like affordable housing. But I think there are two announcements in the budget which have not received as much attention as they should have. And I think these are reforms, real reforms. The first is the effort to recharge the rental housing market, with the government proposing a model tenancy law. Today, India faces a situation where millions of constructed premises are lying unoccupied because the landlords don't want to rent out because of lack of sufficiently strong agreements which can be legally enforced and litigations can be avoided. I think this is something which needs to be corrected. So a model tenancy law brought out by the Ministry of Urban Development for states to be picked up and amended according to their circumstances is a good move in the right direction. Secondly, reforms often depend upon the signal which they convey. And as we understand, and nobody better than Mr. Rai to actually reflect on this, I think reforms essentially are trying to correct what is incorrect. What is wrong needs to be set right. In Indian case, in the housing market, the biggest financier has been the National Housing Bank. But the National Housing Bank paradoxically has also been the regulator of housing finance in India. This is for the first time that the functions have been separated. So the conflict of interest has been avoided. Today, the regulation of the housing finance goes back to the Reserve Bank of India. And the National Housing Bank remains a separate entity and a separate function. So I think rather than looking at big bang reforms, I mean, there's been talk about labor codes, and labor codes or getting them together into 4 codes is nothing but just trying to make some sense out of the large number of labor laws that exist in the state and central sector and put them into some discipline. So I think it's basically these signals which are important to be picked up from the budget in terms of positive developments. But again, to go back to what I began with, if $5 trillion is the objective, then a lot remains to be done. Thank you.